Does anybody have any questions ready to set the ball rolling? Perhaps casting your mind back to Professor Wang's talk right at the beginning, and then we can maybe move through in sequence. Any questions from the audience? Greg.
I'd love to hear a little more about your process for sort of animating your dancers' movements. Did you work with physical dancers? Sorry.
Yeah.
Too late.
I really just show a tip of the iceberg. In fact, it was a very complicated process. So we, first of all, extrapolated images from Dunhuang caves and then classified them, carefully studied them. And then we worked with computer scientists. And the first complaint they had was that you guys just don't know what you're getting into. Because the data set is just way too small. So yeah, we work with different computer scientists. It's very frustrating actually talk to them because they just like scorn the fact that we humanists don't know what we're getting into. And so, but it was a good learning process. So what we learned, okay, what we're going to do. So then we essentially designed some kind of formal language on the basis of our extrapolation of these dancing forms. And then we designed different postures because there are certain set postures that we can kind of come up with, and then we work with professional dancers in Beijing Ballet School, and then brought them to motion capture studio, and have them all wearing sensors, and then motion capture them, then accumulate a huge amount of data. And at that point, the computer scientists finally said, all right, you have enough data. And with that data, then the question is how to really process them and program them. And that's actually also the very challenging part. Essentially, the system, I mean, we use machine learning and all these techniques to train the system to recognize it. But in hindsight, I guess the dancers, the choreographers try to be too smart, so they instead of just being confined to the set postures that we gave them, they try to figure out what's the transition in between these postures. And that creates all kinds of problems, because we could tell what is the posture we want and what's the transition, which is their invention. But the system couldn't recognize. So in the end, when you get to the editing part, the system just wasn't able to discriminate between what is the kind of posture that is more of a Tang or asymmetry style, or what is the sort of modern day imaginary transition. So it got to the point where the system couldn't quite. So in the end, the human intervention is still very important to pick out the ones that we feel more of the Tang style and get rid of. So in hindsight, if we would do it again, we wouldn't ask them to say, the dancers you can't understand because they want to have a continuous dance. But from our point of view, we more want to capture a certain period, characteristic and traits. And so in hindsight, we would do it again. We would say, well, don't do the transition. All we want is just you can do like one posture at a time, and then we can do the rest in the post-production. So yeah, that's the lesson hard learned, and but it's just beginning. It's an ongoing process, so we're still working on it. Yeah. Thank you.
Question from Catherine Jiang.
Oh, I have more of an art historical question. The virtual rendering of the Horyuji temple paintings, the mural paintings, that you said was in Japan? It's not in your cave?
Well, that doesn't depend. We also, because we have copies at Harvard
Oh, I
Museum,
see.
so we actually also digitize them
I
and
was
try
just
to
wondering
work them into our choreography as well. Yeah.
Well, I was wondering about the scale of the paintings, because you have the central Buddha with bodhisattvas, and then you have these bodhisattvas at the side that seem much larger. Is that the way they were painted in Horyuji, or is that just the way they're made to fit on the walls of the reconstructed virtual version?
Yeah, they're largely more or less consistent. But on the other hand, there's still mystery because we have 3 panels and the dates do not accord with the documented project that the Japanese took in the 30s. But our accession number says 1926. So I still need to look more into what's the circumstances of when, because the documentation says, or at least the one that I...
So your panels are
Three
original
of them.
size?
Yes.
I see. But the Buddha group seems, well, I'm just thinking about cave temple paintings, that the Buddha group seems much too small compared to those side bodhisattvas. There are a few of them at the sides that seem much larger, but
Okay. That's a good prompt. I'll go back and do some good measurement and try to figure out. Because at this point,
Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
I haven't been closely attentive enough. Yeah, but that's yeah.
There's a question at the back over there.
Hello. So my question would be actually applied to Maria, but not limited to Maria, probably Ken and William. You could answer this question too. So I'm from American Museum of Natural History, and we do similar stuff in terms of using virtual reality, augmented reality, digitizing all this stuff. And then we found that we had this huge question about if you're making this like cultural objects more accessible or not accessible by digitizing it, because I mean, everything we do is great, but still by digitizing it, you have this limited entry point of, you have to have the device with the content and you have to have an access to digital file. And even your Maria's example, the experience, you have to be still physically there and wear the headset and all, etc. So our question was, we were trying to make it social, we were trying to make it accessible, but at the end of the day, we found the conflict between what we try to do using this technology and eventually can we serve mass audience like we do with big screen or like planetarium show we have in the museum. And I just wanted to hear general thoughts about this concern from you guys.
One of the biggest problems of these technologies is that they are not accessible by definition. That's true, especially the very sophisticated high-end systems. On the other hand, I think I emphasized the fact that we want what we do to be in situ and close to the authentic object, especially when you talk about cultural heritage. We feel that that's important, and we feel that it's important for our visitors as well. They want to be close to. They want to understand and know that what they see was created thousands of years ago, or some other people touched this. And this is very exciting, and I can't think of another way to do it. It's very removed if you actually create a film and you show this to a mass number of people somewhere else. And maybe the connections that they make to the past and this historical empathy will not be as strong as we would want them to be. So one has to find the happy medium. There's no golden rule for that, but I feel that it's important to frame the original, or to use the original as a magnet, and the authentic, and what we create is around that, is in the periphery of it.
And from my perspective, not every experience is right for everybody. And the way I would handle it, thinking about human-centered design, bring some folks that have disabilities in to the experience that exists as it exists now and ask them how they would like to experience it. And I think you might come up with some really creative solutions to how these immersive experience can be immersive to someone that has other abilities, right? So I think that would be a really interesting way of addressing that.
Thank you so much. Sorry. I have a question maybe for Lillian Rosselli, but then also perhaps others as well. I'm really interested in, I think what you're speaking about, this kind of like embodied temporalities, where you can experience the past and the present in tandem with each other. And so in my mind, it kind of creates this interesting kind of timed space. And so I'm wondering how this embodied experience of this kind of, new kind of time space, how it's able to shape your continued practice as a scholar, as a museum professional, and maybe like what kinds of discoveries you found when you're looking at the past and the present in this kind of way, in this kind of embodied way.
Quite a challenging question. So it was quite a long question. Do you think you can compress it to its essence, and then?
I mean, I just think it's really interesting that that we're looking at the past and the present sort of together, right? We're not looking at artifacts, right? That we look within a specific context, and we're not looking at an experience that we're all sharing in this room, devoid from the past. Rather, the past and the present, I feel like they're sort of, they're thickened in a way, right? And it's kind of this new experience, this like interchangeable, mutable kind of past and present together. I don't know if that really makes sense.
We, as Diane, I try to explain to your question. We embodied this ancient, this experience of these drawings on the ruins. It's as I told, it's our reflection of the antiquity. We do not know how they lived really. It's our. In the 80s, they would have done it completely diverse. And I told two lecturers also never, and as I told you too, never using women as protagonists. And so I think that's our connection to the present, and a lot of visitors appreciate this. And in the entrance hall, as I told you, what we leave behind. We have a lot of discussion about also present and future, what we really leave behind, because we don't leave anything behind except of data, and without electricity, nothing will leave. We leave nothing. So only showing our work as archaeologists in this context brings a lot of reaction and reflection about our own life, the present, and how they lived in past, also in a really different, a lot of different ways. And we will go on now in the outdoor area, where you see the problems with climate change, also as in Switzerland and also in these heritage sites. Very much also the fears and so on. We connect this with all these ancient ruins. I hope to somehow to reflect how we thought about.
Professor Wong.
Maybe I can just speak louder.
Yes, sure. Your voice is up.
Just that question. I find this integration of the drawing, reconstruction, and the ruins very interesting, very effective. Actually, exactly, the temporality seems really create a kind of new experience. Also, seems the viewer negotiate like a past and the reconstruction, because we all reconstruct, and we try to ask people to reconstruct imaginatively. So I wonder, you show this particular room, right, like a Roman room. Do you use this concept technology for other places or sites, this kind of overlap or integration?
I think it was the first part, our path as institution to digitality. That's why also I came to Augusta Raurica to change it. And it was really, it's a little bit tricky because of the technological problems. I think we can, I don't know, it goes so fast, development, you know, it was last year, it was modern, I think this year or next year it will be easier available. I actually, at the moment now, I don't think we can do it in the outdoor area, because the problem is we have to have a Wi-Fi connection to do it, and in the outdoor area it's rather difficult. But who knows what is possible next year, you know?
Well, anyway, I find it very interesting because when we do reconstruction, like we did in the center, we make everything looks new or something.
Right.
Then seems just the temporality is just a single, but yours seems there preserves some these ruins, oldness, and the reconstruction. I find that very, very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
As we go into a new kind of museum, which is no longer concentrating on artifacts, but really more on an interactive experience, what kind of relationships does this create between us as scholars and the people who run museums, who are generally older and may or may not appreciate some of this? If you had experiences with the senior management and the financing and so.
Why? Well, I have some, bloody war stories to tell you between not just the senior management, but the archaeologists and the technologists. That's where a lot of issues, we came across a lot of issues. For example, the Acropolis Museum. We started this project in 2011. The first meeting we had was with a big group. We were about 20 people. The director of the museum, who passed away last September, Professor Padermalis, a renowned archaeologist, and you're yes, and a wonderful person. His particular research was in the colors of the statues that we also showed in this experience. So the first meeting, we were all together, technologists. We didn't know each other. Most people didn't know each other. And the technologists started rushing and saying, and we can do this and we can do that, and we'll put augmented reality and blah, blah, and SLAM and this and that, all these synchronous location and mapping and so on, all these techniques. And Professor Padermalis stops them at some point and says, whoa, you technologists are used to thinking in nanoseconds, and we archaeologists are thinking in centuries. So we have to find some way to bridge this gap. And I must say, after 3 years, we didn't quite manage to bridge the gap that much, even though the results were pretty astounding, but there still was a big problem. Also between the storyteller who we had hired, who was not an archaeologist, but he brought in humor, he brought in this, he was amazing, very creative, But the archaeologists were shocked when they would see his first drafts of the story and the mistakes that they had in them. So this, one of the challenges of incorporating digital technologies in our fields, in these fields of archaeology and history of art and the humanities, is that you really need to embrace an interdisciplinary approach. And you really need teams of Renaissance people in them who do a little bit of everything. And this is change that is very difficult to happen. But it will go that way. I think in every domain, this is the case nowadays. So it's a challenge that slowly, I believe, will start to be workable.
Okay, so I had a little experience with this when I curated an exhibition for my hometown. I came with a friend who had a 360-degree camera, and we did some 360-degree work. And the head of the community for the exhibition, I actually gave him a VR headset to wear, and he's actually a professor of education. And when he wore it, he walked around, looked around, he took it off. He said, "What's this?" I was like, "This is a new experience." He said he understands, but why do we need it? And so I was like, okay, we are at the height of the COVID period. And so like people in diaspora, like people who couldn't come, needed to see. But he didn't see the need for it. He didn't see the usefulness of it. And so he scrapped it out of the budget. And so this is what, I'm new in this space, but I'm beginning to see that these are the challenges there. And so I contacted an uncle who was a professor of African history, and he came, and then he started showing me the reasons why people were being adamant to these new technologies, because it's like teaching an old dog a new trick. Like you have to really make them understand why they needed to use such technologies. And so I think it's trying to bring in the new generation. We are all interested in the aesthetics to the old generations of the ways of doing things. And I think a very important part of it is having the gatekeepers as, they are the historians of cultural heritage, like from different sub-communities, having them part of the project. Because that way it will be able, we could easily get the attentions of other people who are maybe not art historians, but who are also aged too, because oral tradition needs to be preserved. And I think most of the things we are digitizing are not just tangibles, but they are the intangibles and the tangibles, which the oral historians, they know. So making them part of the project, it goes a long way, because that way they'll be able to be more expressive. And so I guess that's the way forward. So, yeah.
A little bit of the everything, everywhere, all at once kind of vibe, Like, what's that leap between the past and our heritage and the heritage we're creating today? Right? That connection that we're making something that's going to be viewed as heritage in the future. So making those things real, I think, through the storytelling, emotive bridges is wonderfully powerful. And I think new generations especially are thinking about the world differently and want to experience the past differently. So I think there's a lot of tools that are really important to do that.
Lillian, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I think that's really important. That's why we choose a little bit this way, because the young people, they don't care about Romans, they don't know who the Romans are, they're coming and think, oh, it's Game of Thrones or something like that, or a mix of everything. So sometimes we really start at a 0 point, but these young people are the stakeholders of in the future, and they have to give the money to care for us. So we have to find a language which involves them, or they want to hear about it. And for me, it's really important to do something for them, and also to show the value to know the past.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating panel, and I even want to call forward some of Jeffrey Shaw's work in my question, because he's credited as making the very first interactive artwork in the world in 1989, which was his Legible City. And in his lecture, he spoke to a commitment to real-time performativity across his practice. And so I feel here we are in 2023, many of us, are in this cultural heritage field, and there is such an importance placed upon really vivid rendering of data and really, complexly reconstructed sites digitally. So I want to ask how actually, being able to do something like render in real time a complex reconstruction as you move around it, that's very difficult and is like a huge problem that tech companies are currently facing as they prepare for the metaverse. So I would like to ask you, from your experiences, how multi-sensory dimensions have been able to activate performativity. It's been really interesting to hear the ways in which you've invoked things like audio and narratives, and especially to hear from your experiences of collecting user feedback and observing users. So would love to hear more about how can we cultivate something like real-time performativity relative to these really rich historical data sets.
Maria, do you want to start that one?
So the last example that I showed, the Bridges project, which really the stage is the entire room, whichever room that is. So this embodied nature of the interaction, I think, embeds this kind of performativity on behalf of the users, the visitors themselves. We don't like, especially, I've been working with virtual reality since the 90s. I hate the head-mounted displays. I hate the technology. I hate the backpacks that we have to carry around that are needed to render the real-time imagery that you are alluding to. And but we assume and suppose that, and it will happen, that this technology will slowly become smaller, will disappear, will become cheaper. So that's what we're interested now, is in looking at what the experience is and how the experience can become what will be meaningful and meaning-making for our users. So we are very interested in evaluation. We do that a lot. We have a lot of visitors. We just finished it in the Bridges project with 73 actual visitors of all ages and technological competencies and so on. Exactly to study what the effect is of all of these various multisensory embodied features that extended realities afford in the experience itself, assuming that the technological aspect will not be there. So it will be disappearing and we can focus on the essence. So I do think that these kinds of more embodied, taking the technology out of the way experiences do involve their users in this a performance where they take central stage.
Right, thank you. I think we all kind of know now there are a large population, particularly young people, playing games, these interactive games, and doesn't matter how hard we try, we can never beat that kind of attraction because they always go for that. So technology goes its own way. So my question is really for, I think it's twofold. One is particularly referred to Eugene's project, because from my perspective as a museum curator, I see Eugene's work is more like creating a work of art. So it's not really trying to reconstruct something like what already in the past, like very different from Lillian's project, like an archaeologist's perspective. You're trying to reconstruct and give some kind of context to the archaeological site. And so that actually is two very different purpose. So when I was lucky to visit Eugene's lab, actually experienced that program, and I really felt, it's not just looking at the Dunhuang or anything. I was trying, actually I almost got, because you got these multiple screens, and so not just to show you one dimension, you actually show different dimensions. So now I understand that you actually trying to come out, create, almost like artists trying to create a work. A bit conceptual, but you use this new technology. So that's very much like if I'm a museum curator, I would treat it as a work of art. I would not to use it for education purpose, like you go to archaeological site, you need that kind of reconstruction to help you to experience the past. So that's kind of one thing. Another thing Mr. Wang has left, for new technology, it's very costly, and it is very short-lived. So that's the trouble. If you spend a lot of money creating some program, and in next year or in 2 years' time, you have to restart again, spend a lot of money, redo it. That's why I think museums, or a lot of museums are reluctant to go very deep into that, particularly large museums. If you are a small museum, you can kind of adopt very quickly, because I did ask our director, I said, are we going to do any more this digital things? He said, oh, no, it will pass. And so still the experience with a real object can never be replaced. So that's why I think a lot of museum curators think, right, what we need to do is really trying to let people to experience the real object. But I personally agree, all this technology, particularly kind of a new way of showing and experiencing, they do help, particularly to the younger generation of audience. Yeah, okay.
Well, Tao, I think that's a fair question. You're really spot on. We are creating a work of art, but in the same time, we're also reconstructing experience and structural experience. In other words, especially with regard to cave dance, as I show, all these statues, wall paintings, actually they are pointing to an invisible space and the process. And that is actually the hardest part for laymen or not someone who haven't studied Buddhist art to understand, because at the end of the day, it is really that disembodied, so-called disembodied spirit consciousness that's going around in this liminal space where you don't see them, of course. But all these sculptures and painting are kind of implying that they are aware and they're concerned about its trajectory. So for us, what we do is try to bring that invisible realm to externalize that. And that, of course, is to some extent also reconstruction, except that what is it that we reconstruct is more that invisible realm and that process. So deep structure, in other words, that we're trying to reconstruct. And so to that extent, it's also a good educational tool in the sense that that's exactly where the discussion can be had. Like, okay, you have a physical cave, you go in, you look at the paintings, but what is really going on there is actually what I call intramural, the sort of thing that is in between the walls, and that's the real event. And that's a part that I think needs, therefore the digital medium is very powerful in making that invisible somehow visible. Yeah.
This reminds me of a form of therapy my family's been going through called dialectical behavioral therapy. And in that form of therapy, which is based off of Buddhist practice actually, You have the rational mind and you have your emotional mind. And it acknowledges the full spectrum of who you are as a human. And so when I think of these things and I think of objects and I think of, okay, we want to understand the real object as it was to the best of our ability, you know, like this real rational, data-driven, and that's fully human, fully good, right? But it's also really great to acknowledge our emotional self. And so I think it's just a spectrum that I think is really informative when you're not just set in one place or the other. You're really walking in between those places. And I think some of these, the narrative-based storytelling can be really informative, and it really sits with you, not just in your mind, but in your spirit and your heart. And those things you remember, right? You might, what do they say, you might forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. So that idea is definitely true, I think, in this space too.
I had like an interaction. I was introduced to NFTs, and they said that it wouldn't function in the museum world, that it would just be an era that would come and go. And I realized that more auction houses were jumping on NFTs. And basically, like, you have the younger generations, they don't actually want to go to museums. They see it as boring. And so the digital space is helping them understand more why they need to go to museums. And I believe with augmented reality and with the physical space as it brought together, museum curators could become really tricky with it and get more newer audiences to the space. So it's not going anywhere. It might be more expensive. It might be like, for me, I don't even have any technology to work with. Yeah, because the gadgets they require, they are really expensive. But at some point you find a way to work with it. So it's finding how to bring the old and the new together, how to amalgamate them together. But I think digital is here to stay, and COVID made us see that like you don't need to go to an actual museum for you to have the experience, even though the physical work is still important. So it's how to mesh them together. I think that's where we are right now. So.
I wanted a note on cost. You mentioned expensive as well. Mobile phones are not costly anymore. Everybody has them. And they bring your own device concept to the museum. We saw examples today. It's simple. So it's, I think the expensive part is in building the content. And small museums have reservations on that because, first of all, there is a fear of technology, and then they also don't know what it takes to build this content, to bring together these interdisciplinary teams who will work on an iterative approach that has hundreds of iterations again and again to get it to work, and evaluations and cycles of evaluating and reflecting and putting the revising and again. This is what costs. Unfortunately, this is something that has nothing to do with the tech, because the tech will become cheaper and cheaper as we go along. And you can do these experiences with simple mobile phones, like I showed in some of our examples. We worked with some big museums, but we work with a lot of small museums, and we've created tools for them to author their own storytelling experiences. However, the mindset has to change, and that's what is costly in a sense, and expensive.
Also, I want to add on in terms of the cost talk, I mean, we're good friends. So I would just say that, in fact, if you compare, let's say, mounting two exhibition, one is more tech-driven, more kind of virtual-oriented. Another is real object curation. In fact, the real object curation probably more expensive because if you think about the insurance and all that, that's really quite an endeavor. We all know how costly that is, right? You know more than anyone else. So I will say, yeah, so I agree that in fact, this kind of interactive, virtual medium driven kind of thing could be relatively manageable compared with getting borrowing all these expensive artworks and ship them to one place, then the hefty insurance involved is just quite prohibitive. All right. Yeah.
I think also that if you don't have a good idea, the expensive technology doesn't help. So you have to create a good content with a simple technology, a QR code, for example, and you have the idea for your museum, and that will not be so expensive and affordable, also for more smaller museums.
I also have a related question. So seems like the technology, you want to use this one or that one is because budget issue. That's very important. But at the same time, how do you decide? From the very beginning, I want to use this, I want to use that. There's several different realities we mentioned about virtual reality, extended reality, enhanced reality. So many different things are available right now. So how do you decide? I think that's one thing. The other thing is that how much your content is being decided by the technology that you use. So, and then do you manage that? To what extent the technological intervention is necessary or is actually unnecessary? So even for Eugene's example, so you feel like your art is being inspired by the technology, or it's actually the other way around. So you're actually using it to kind of create. So I think that's kind of something that we also try to decide, to what extent that we need to rely on the technology, but not to be bound by it. So.
Yeah, no, that's totally the core of the game is precisely that. So, but I feel mostly from my experience working with all these projects, it's still really the concept design is the most important. And so that, but in other words, the concept design involves someone who really knows the content. But then, of course, you need to be aware of what's the sort of technological means available. And at that time, it's really the teamwork that matters. But I don't think in any of our projects ever driven by technologies, frankly. It's always the content design, the concept design that is the hardest part. And then once that is kind of more or less worked out, some kind of blueprint worked out, then you work with the team, then the technological component becomes more pronounced. Otherwise, yeah, so I still, at the end of the day, it's the concept design that rules the day, yeah.
So, yeah, so during my stay at Syracuse University, I learned communication of practice from Ken. And so he taught about that different communications determine on your audience. And so in terms of the technology, it has to do with your audience. Like if you want to find, if your audience is on TikTok, you have to know how to structure it. The communications to those people, and that if it's going to use like YouTube, you know how to structure it. So I think it's more or less on the technology and more on the audience, like who are you trying to reach and how are you trying to reach them. I think that determines the technology to be used.
I noticed during Lillian Rosselli's talk, you gave a piece of very practical advice, right? It was just like pick your technology first and then populate it. That sounded like a reaction to an experience, right? And actually it sounds quite different from what Professor Wang, how you described your concept-driven approach. Do you want to tell us why you gave that bit of practical advice?
Yes. Ask our digital experts. We had an idea, and he had to create the whole app around this idea, and that was really for him. He suffered a lot. Because as I told you, we were really accurate and wanted it like we wanted. And he told, if you go on, please choose first the technology. It's especially in the outdoor area where you don't have Wi-Fi everywhere. And also, and we made, in the meantime, we made some trials. So I showed you the theater, and we want, of course, we want a reconstruction, and you can go inside. Perfect. But the problem is, you are in the outside area and sloping, and it's very dangerous because the people, they are so attracted of their device, they don't see that it goes down. So we couldn't do it. We cannot do it. It's too dangerous. And things like this, you know, it's also practical. Also, think also at the audience how to do it, and I think be as simple as possible. It's really the cheapest way. And as an outdoor area, I wanted to say virtual reality. We didn't want it because I say you have at least to have offers in an outdoor area as ours, where you can travel an hour, 2 hours to reach, and you want to have a good time, as I told there. So, and with offers and for virtual reality with your headsets, you don't have to go to a place. You can do it in your room. It's expensive, but you know, an outside our area is the same as a museum in a house. So.
I just wanted to say that I understand the practical advice of choose the technology first, but I think it should be chosen last. The message that the museum wants to convey should come first, then which technology, if needed, is needed to convey that message, and then choose the technology. So I believe it should go the other way around. But I understand the practical purpose, and actually many places, the foundation of the Hellenic World where I worked, when I went there, they chose the technology first. They wanted to have the most innovative technology that was around. So we had to go about. That's why they found me, and that's why I went there, and that's why we set up the virtual reality department there, because they had chosen the technology first. But then you have to deal with, what do I do with this? How do I resolve issues that are driven by the technological challenges? And that's not how you should be going about it. What the museum has to convey, what the message it wants to give to its audience should be the driving force, in my view.
Everything, everywhere, all at once. It's like messy, right? I mean, this stuff is just messy. And they're like, one method that works in one community won't work in another because of all, and that's okay. Like the spaghetti, you have to be okay with the spaghetti. And like just unpacking it and making sense of it and ideating and playing with it and seeing what makes sense at the end of the day for you in your situation, your community.
Maybe I just want to jump in the last one because Jeffrey Shaw's video, I mean, was so impressive, so impressive. So that's why I mean, from a museum point of view, I mean, you can see he used all different kind of technology to create almost like a digital exhibition. But his last exhibition he did in 2 locations, one in Hong Kong, one in Taiwan. And I don't know, but just from what he showed, in Hong Kong he had real objects together with his digitizations. And in Taiwan he only had a digital version. So, I mean, unfortunately he's not here because I was really trying to find out what's people's reaction to these 2 different shows. Because for me, if I watch it, I would feel, if we have all these objects in the museum, if the technology can be really used to enhance those real objects, then that's perfect way to go for museums. Yeah. But yeah, is he online? I mean, I have to thank him because when I did the bronze show 2018, we used his, he made this archery ritual with Jonathan Chang, and we used it. But that time we couldn't use like interactive. We only used the program he created. Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for making this a wonderful afternoon for us. Our time is up, so we'll have to leave this space. But the ISAC Museum is still open.